Well, good afternoon to all of our friends at Exarban Village. Claire and I are in the Colorado mountains, as you can tell from behind me. You know, this is my home state, and so getting back to Colorado is really an important touchstone for me, the beauty of the mountains. But Claire and I, in our 51 years of marriage, we've also established a lot of history related to these Colorado mountains. The present trip that we're on, we're spending 4 days here in the Keystone, Silverthorne, Breckenridge area. And then in 3 days, we've got friends coming out. And there's another couple, two couples, and we'll be spending time together before we come back on Friday. But I want to talk to you about mountains in this little sermonette this morning. Mountains for everybody, not just for Claire and I, are majestic, they're mysterious, they're miraculous, they're inspirations to everyone. They are so big, they're so ancient, they're so powerfully indicative of the power of the Creator God that made them. Now the fact is, mountains are mentioned hundreds of times in the Bible. And the reason is because they were a prominent feature. Mountain bug on my glasses. They were a prominent feature of the landscape of Palestine. But the mountains there were not the ones with beautiful pine trees that you see behind me. They were very rugged, very barren of trees and flowers. They were really quite rocky. And again, because it was a standard feature, you have mentioned in both the Old and New Testament, they're usually, when they're mentioned, it's a literal meaning, but occasionally it also stands as a metaphor for power, for solidity, and most often of all, for the power of God in creation. Well, I've been thinking specifically on this trip about some of the references to mountains in the book of Psalms, and that's what I want to talk to you about. They are, as I mentioned, most creatively used as God's examples of his power. But as awesome as the mountains are, God is much, much greater. Let me cite just a couple of examples. In Psalm 90, verse 2, before the mountains were born, or speaking of God, you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. That scripture emphasizes God's eternal existence, his creative power. Before the mountains were born, before anything on earth was, God was. God is. God will be. He is forever all-powerful. So those mountains that you see behind me, God made them. And he was there before they existed, and he'll be after they melt and he starts the new creation all over again. Psalm 65:6, speaking of God, the God who establishes the mountains by his strength, being girded, that is, around his waist is might. How the awesomeness of the mountains are again shown to emphasize the power of God, the Creator God. God is strong enough to make mountains, and if you go further in Psalm 65, you see that it talks about God creating the seas, the world's population, the dawn, the sunset, the rivers, the harvests, everything that is, God created. God is powerful. And one more scripture that I find especially wonderful and comforting is how this mountain reference underscores the marvelous truth that all-powerful deity is nevertheless an intimately personal God who cares enough about his children to protect them. I'm talking about Psalm 46, verses 1 through 3. It's in your handout. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, and though the mountains, these mountains, slip into the heart of the seas. though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride. God talks about him being a refuge, a fortress to flee into safety. But also, he talks about strength. Strength that one scholar says means to cope manfully with the dangers that assail us. So God is our defense, but he's also our offense. He's our strength in the enemies coming against us. He's also our strength as we go ahead and face the enemy head on. It reminds me of a fortress in the medieval days that had a wonderful castle keep, but it also was created with sally ports. And that's where when the people inside the fortress decided to sally forth in offensive action, they could take the cavalry and ride out. It says that this God is a very present help in trouble. What kind of trouble? Any kind of trouble. Illness, fear, loneliness, temptations, grief, disappointment, you name it. Any kind of trouble. It says this powerful God who is a refuge and our strength is a very present help. You need help now? He will provide it. Just call on it and he'll be there. He is more to be trusted, this psalm is emphasizing, than are the mountains to stand in their majesty. The mountains may slip into the sea. That will not affect the ever-present help that is our God. God stays. God cares. And God will help. Is it great for Claire and I to be the mountains? It certainly is. But greater still, greater beyond anything, is that we know that the personal God has humbled himself to appear in the incarnation as a man, Jesus Christ, who humbled himself even further to die a criminal's death on that cross to pay for my sin and your sin. That's greater than being in the mountains any day. We will see you next Sunday, Lord willing. Thanks so much for being around us.